Hi, I'm Kate Warren at Devex, hosting today's discussion on anti-racism and hiring in global development. Thank you all for tuning in. As I'm sure everyone has witnessed, global events in the past year have prompted more and more conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion in development, and really how much work our sector needs to do. The institutions driving development agenda, funding, programming are too white, too male, typically come from privileged backgrounds, and really do not reflect the diversity of our global community. In response, organizations have released statements against racism, formed working groups, and vowed to re-examine their policies and procedures. But the challenges of systemic racism aren't so easy to undo with just a few written statements or policies. So today we want to discuss the challenges which continue to face professionals from minority groups as they try to break into the sector, move up in their career, and share ideas and learnings for the kind of change they would like to see in organizations. I am delighted to be joined by an amazing group of women, each of which is on the front lines of leading change and discussions on racism and development, and many of them doing this work on top of their day jobs, I might add. So we're really grateful for them to spend this time with us today. So first joining us are Sanam Jain and Melissa Nicholson, who are both co-founder and co-leads of Bame Id, which they created to help address the issue of underrepresentation of ethnic minorities in UK international development organizations and provide a platform for BAME practitioners to network, exchange knowledge, and share opportunities. We also have Lena Biru, who is an events and program manager at Bond UK, and their lead on anti-racism work, where she is currently working to roll out sector support to actively create an anti-racist sector by engaging those who are in positions of power. Lena is also a committee member for Charity So White and on the working group of the Racial Equity Index. And finally, we have Layla Billing, who's senior advisor on gender, youth, and movement building and anti-racism organizer in the global development space, who has been working with Bond and others, particularly at the intersection of gender and race. So thank you all so much for joining us today. So Sanam, I'd like to start with you. So you and Melissa created the Bame Id Network, which I referenced in your introduction. Can you share a little bit more about the group and what inspired you to start it?
Sure, thank you, Kate. So yeah, Bame Id was kind of a baby that was created last year, mainly from realizing whilst working in the private sector development space that we didn't feel like there were many people who looked like us. So black and brown colleagues who might have had lived experiences within within other countries or shared same experiences that we did as being second generation or first generation, and we felt like having that experience was something that bonded us and maybe gave us something different to bring to the international development sector as well, and something that maybe only we really understood or realized, and we wanted to actually bring those people together. So that's when Bame Id was created, originally as a LinkedIn network, like you said, for people who identify as ethnic minorities, Black, Asian. There's contention around the different uses of the term BAME and people of colour. And we wanted to be a platform to facilitate conversation, allow for sharing of learnings, and also kind of inspire a new generation of international development practitioners. So since then, we are now a LinkedIn group of 250 members strong. We've held many events across different platforms, so internally, events like this, and also with other organisations as well, for our members, but also for hiring managers within private sector organisations working in the space. And Melissa, I don't know if you wanted to add anything else to that.
Yeah, sure. Hi everyone, great to be here. What we found is that though we began as a network wanting to see other people like us, it quickly grew to a space where we were almost becoming a resource and support hub that fostered learning and was encouraging collaboration, not just between individuals, but then now between organizations. We kind of realized that the key gap was that there wasn't this organization to organization partnership on the topic of diversity and inclusion and equity. So we've really kind of grown into that space where we not only prioritize the voices of the practitioners within our LinkedIn network and fostering connections and also job opportunities, but now we're working kind of cross-sector really intentionally. And that's been the most exciting part, I would say, of our journey so far, just seeing that desire to work, even though we're normally competitors in the space, now we're actually working for this common goal of racial equity, diversity and inclusion. A lot of the work is being done by Black and Brown practitioners, admittedly, but we also have some amazing allies that have really stepped up to the plate following the events of this summer.
Great, thanks, Melissa. And just following on that, I know that your group provides a safe space, or a term I heard recently loved, a brave space for professionals to share their stories and experiences. So what are some of the stories you hear about barriers to breaking into development and moving up in this career? Things that maybe some organizations aren't even aware of, maybe would be surprised to learn about themselves.
Sure. So some of the issues that are most commonly felt from our members, who span across different parts of the sector, some in the charity side and the NGO side, and some in the private sector. Many talk about kind of the old school male, pale and stale boys clubs that still exist, whether on paper or not, and the lack of opportunity to break into that purely because you're not white or male. There's also a lot of challenges around kind of the sticky frozen middle ground. So the middle management level that it might be easier to get up to a director or just below a director, but as soon as you want to kind of really make change within a company, you find that it's actually quite difficult and you're not actually getting into the rooms where decisions are made. We also find that, when it comes to the intersections between race and other areas such as class, a lot of people of colour might be coming from, certain universities that aren't in the cadre of universities that are traditionally associated with the classic international development masters, or the classic forms of education that are typically seen within our sector and required from terms of reference, and that can be due to many issues, especially around class, the intersections between class and race. So that, those are the main reasons for why they haven't really managed to either break in or develop in the career.
I think as well, some of the comments that we've had, which have been interesting, there's an expectation that because you work within the development sector, then you can't possibly be racist because the beneficiaries are Black and Brown. But there's a lot of unconscious bias, which many of our members have begun having unlearning conversations within their organizations to kind of unpick some of the prevailing stereotypes, or just some of the language that's just highly inappropriate. So perhaps it's the use of the term coloured, but that's your colleague and they're lovely and they're really kind, they can't possibly be racist, but there's still some terms that are problematic, and challenging those is important because they mount to become the microaggressions that make the workspace uncomfortable or unpleasant, or you constantly feel othered, even though perhaps you're in a senior position within the organization. So I think this challenge of maybe it's not the overt racism that people then can point to, so it can't possibly exist if it's not that kind of big and bold and ugly, but kind of the smaller things that other the practitioners make their experiences unpleasant, and then the persisting view of this kind of fly in, fly out culture of the experts coming in to explain the problems that exist in countries that aren't third world to us, but are like our home countries, or the home countries of our friends or families. That kind of language, again, is something that has to be addressed. And when it comes to hiring, by having other people that look like us, we're going to start using different language, and hopefully that would then become the norm rather than some of the language that persists at present.
Yeah, language is so important. As you mentioned, even there can be controversy over what terms to use that, I've seen some individuals, organizations then say, okay, well, I'm too afraid of doing the wrong thing. But what advice would you give to them about breaking past those fears, maybe being more vulnerable, being open to making mistakes, but learning.
I'll go, Sana, then you.
Yeah, sure.
One of the things that we've spoken about on our monthly booster calls, where we have the actual development practitioners who are the ones who are doing the work. Like Bame Id has a very working group kind of mentality. It's not kind of the group that you just join and observe from the outside. A lot of people that do join are actively within their organizations trying to advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion when it comes to race. So they find themselves being the ones to have the difficult conversations. And though they want to do that, it is burdensome at the same time. So on one side, Google exists and it's your friend. So we invite and encourage Googling as a really key way of kind of exploring language. But also, if you come with a certain sense of humility, talking on behalf of myself and Sanam, I think we could say, if you're coming from a place of humility and a genuine desire to learn on a one-to-one basis, I would be more than happy to have a difficult conversation, or one, Melissa, I don't even know how to refer to you when there's like a group of people. Like, are you the Black woman in the room? Are you the colored woman? How can I refer to you? It's a bit of a sticky one, I know. And that's difficult to kind of accept not knowing, but those brave conversations are the things that actually then break down barriers and make the sector a much friendlier place, and a place where I'm actually going to want to kind of work in that environment. So having those conversations, and also just kind of looking around at who's not in the room, because if they're not there, then they can't contribute and give their viewpoint. And I guess we'll touch on that a bit more as well as we go through. Sanam?
Yes, I'll echo what Melissa said about having those brave conversations. I think from our members' perspective, and even from colleagues, myself, I know that they'd much prefer a company and a leadership to not overpromise on things they're going to do, but more just promise to have the conversation in an open and an honest way, and facilitated in an appropriate way as well. So considering all of the nuances and considering all of the reasons for why this is actually a really difficult conversation for many to have. I think it's really key to for those who are hiring managers or in positions of power within organizations to understand that everyone is on this journey as well. So hiding behind I don't know what to do is no longer good enough. Now it's a case of, well, this is the platform, this is now, you've been given the platform to make change, and we're asking for small steps towards a long-term change. So it's not about thinking I might do something wrong. It's just having the conversation in the first place and committing to learning. And as Melissa said, it's about Googling, but also as leaders, understanding your own privilege and understanding the ways in which you may have already impacted or contributed to unconscious bias, in systemic racism in your company, from a place of wanting to improve. So I think those are quite powerful but small ways in which we can kind of have change.
Yeah, and you spoke a little bit about intersectionality and the importance of that. And I'm here in the US, where we just finished, or hopefully finished, a presidential election, where there was a lot of criticism on how the parties treated minority groups as like a monolith, not recognizing that they're, for example, Latinos are a diverse group with different experiences and perspectives. Do you have similar concerns about how organizations are viewing or engaging with underrepresented identities, and seeing it as a one group rather than really recognizing how much diversity that there is within diversity?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And this is where I think the intersections between race and class really matter here. So for example, for me, although I'm saying class because I'm from the Midlands, it is very apparent to me that as a South Asian woman, as an Indian woman who has a relatively educated background, a middle class background, that I do find I recognize my own privilege in being able to have certain conversations, have access to certain meeting rooms, and actually have the people who need to listen to me, whereas I know that some of my colleagues might not have that ability. And I think one thing that at Bame Id we've realised is that there is a huge desire to amplify the voices of our Black colleagues and peers, both women and men. And in particular, we've realised that there are not many Black men in our network and in the space. So what we found, especially in our monthly booster calls that Melissa mentioned earlier, is that a lot of our Asian and South Asian peers really want to understand how they can amplify and the voices and help their Black colleagues progress and specifically have that lens on it as well. And I can only imagine it's kind of a similar situation in the US.
I was going to add, maybe Layla would be great on this one. Intersectionality is her area of expertise. Do you want to come in, Layla, on this one?
Yeah, thanks for that, Sanam, and for the question, Kate. I think one thing I wanted to share with you is how I see this showing up in terms of anti-racism work in the UK. I think from discussions with some of the groups of people of colour that Lena and I mobilise and that we engage with, what we're seeing a lot of is leaders kind of defaulting to single strand thinking when it comes to discussions about race and racism, and how that kind of shows up is we're seeing situations where race is being pitted against work on gender, and it's kind of in competition with each other, so in an environment where resources are finite, they're very stretched, an organization wants to do anti-racism work, in some cases, what we're seeing is that they're putting some of the gender equity work on the back burner. And I think there's a real problem there. To frame it positively, I think there's a real need, and I would really encourage leaders to kind of do the learning around intersectionality and to really engage with the theory of it so they can start to kind of use it as a lens to apply to their work. Because I think if we don't collectively understand how these different oppressions intersect in the ways that Sanam has just described, it's going to be impossible for us to develop the kind of policies and processes that are actually going to make sure everyone is thriving. I think, when we continue to address race in a silo, too many people are going to fall through the cracks, basically.
Yeah, thank you for that, Layla. And Lena, we'll move over to you. And you've been at Bond working with leaders across UK and development organizations. And we recognize there is underrepresentation of ethnic minorities, particularly at the leadership level. So what conversations are you hearing among leaders to address this imbalance?
Thanks, Kate. There's a mixture of the CEOs that we talk to. Bond has a membership of 450 NGOs, so as you can imagine, there's lots of people to talk to. And what we've recognized is that people are on different points on their journey to understanding and to moving to become actively anti-racist. There is goodwill there, and I think obviously that was heightened over the summer with the brutal murder of George Floyd. This really brought to the fore why the sector needs to take this seriously, because it speaks exactly to the heart of what the sector does. But there are also those who still have that fear and who still perhaps have that pressure. They feel that in a different way in terms of the dynamics of boards, in terms of being accountable, who they're accountable to, the marginalized communities they work with, or their staff internally. There's a lot of complexities around it, but there is an intention there for leaders to get to grips with this. And that has been really heartening to see. There's a lot of work to do on this, but it's good to be able to know that you're not just banging on a closed door, like the door has opened up a little bit. But one of the things that in the conversations that I have, certainly with leaders, is we don't really couch it in, equity, diversity and inclusion. We just talk about power and privilege, because we want to get to the heart of what it is that we're talking about. And something that we talk about, particularly from the charity So White work that I do. We know that too easily diversity and inclusion can become a shield and an excuse to not specifically progress the anti-racism agenda and to address racism in the sector. And this is why we don't want to hide behind things. We don't want to hide behind terminologies. But the other reason that we directly talk about power and privilege is to acknowledge that it exists, and for those with privilege, with white privilege, to acknowledge that, to use their power in a different way, and to explore what else they can do with the power that they do hold. But that is what we are talking about. And we do not want it to be diluted by being parked in HR or just one specific function in an organization, when actually, in order to really make a difference in the sector, we need to understand that this work is everybody's problem. It's not just senior management, it's not just the CEOs, it's not just the board, it's everybody's problem. And in the end, it will strengthen the sector as well.
Yeah, and so, you know, this racial justice movement is coming the same time that many organizations, particularly in the UK charity sector, are facing funding cuts, layoffs, furloughs as a result of the pandemic. So meaning there are probably less resources available to invest in, say, hiring or other initiatives. So in some of your discussions, do you see this impacting organizations' either willingness or ability to make big changes? And do you think it's a resource problem or more of a culture shift problem?
So the sector obviously is going through an uncertain time at the moment, and you know, we don't know where we will be in 6 months' time, particularly what the landscape of the sector will look like, how many organizations will still be surviving. And so that's one thing and one area that Bond is working actively to support our members on, specifically in terms of funding. I think there is, and certainly what Layla and I have seen, particularly working with our POC and development group, is that there is a feeling of exhaustion. We're coming to the end of the year. The momentum that we had over the summer is somewhat waning. And so that is reflected in the way that perhaps organizations are prioritizing this. And perhaps this has fallen down the priority list in some organizations. There have been some organizations that I've actively spoken to, and they are really committed to this. They are taking this seriously, and it's not just about having a webinar on this. It's actually about laying out investment and commitment for the next 6 months to really get to grips with what this means to their organization. So there are those organizations who are taking this really seriously. And interestingly, it's been the middle to smaller size ones that have been committing to the long-termness nature of this work. Whilst the larger ones do face the same, issues as well, restructuring, thinking about how they can best deliver their mission if they do, have financial cuts or anything else. They're able to change things in a different way, and I think that's about decision making and who they have in the room. And one of the things that I think is crucial to all of this work, whether you're a small organization or a larger one, is really not just thinking about what data is out there, but actually understanding where your organization is, your individual organization, because they're all in different places. And whether you have, and I use the term POC, people of color, whether you have people of color in your organization or not, and do you actually understand, to what extent do you understand their experience of being in your organization? And that's where you really need to start with this. So even though, unfortunately, it feels like on some levels and some fronts it is slipping down the agenda, there is enough momentum in the sector from a Bame Id, from the POC and development group, from diasporic development, from Charity So White, from so many movements in the sector, that we've created these spaces to come together and to support each other, and we will continue driving this forward. But yes, it's a mixed bag, really. It's a mixed bag as we end the year. And my hope is that with conversations like these and other conversations that are going on in the sector, that we'll keep this on the agenda, because at the end of the day, getting this right underpins every area of what we do, regardless of what type of service delivery your organization does. It does make our organizations better, and we do ourselves a disservice if we are just really forging along and ignoring this and going along with a homogenous workforce. It does us no good, and it holds us back.
Yeah, you mentioned kind of the importance of data. I know that's a real challenge, is getting good data out there to be able to measure against. And Layla, you've been working with Bond on a survey to try to provide more data on state of racism in the UK development space. I know this is still currently underway, but at this point, what can you share about either what you've learned to date or what you hope to learn?
Yeah. So yeah, just before I go into that, just speaking about data, I just want to speak to another thing that we're seeing among the groups of people of color that we engage with. You know, I'd like to think that a few killer statistics are going to shift the needle as much as I'd like it to, but the reality is, you know, we've had statistics on diversity in the sector for a long time. We've known how paltry, you know, our efforts around diversity and inclusion have been, and yet we haven't really done anything about it. And one of the things we've seen again and again from the people we work with is that, you know, people of color are often kind of asked by leaders for more data. You know, well, we need more data on this before we can move, or we need you to research this area before we can make a decision on that. And sometimes I just want to caveat the whole data point by saying sometimes this can be used as a bit of a displacement tactic. So, you know, demands for more data can be used to kind of kick social justice issues into the long grass. So I want to kind of put that out there. I think it's really important to be realistic about that. So in terms of the data that we've been collecting with Lena and I and some other colleagues in Bond, we've done both quantitative and qualitative research with people of colour in the sector, and it's primarily been with people of colour working for UK NGOs, and we've included national staff of UK NGOs around the world within that data set too. And we've really been looking at what are the barriers to entry and progression within the UK NGO space, and more details on that will come out later in the year. But I think just to echo a lot of what Sanam has been saying about, you know, what's happening, you know, so some big themes coming up are around occupational segregation within the sector. So there's, you know, meaning there's some areas of work that it's still very hard for people of colour to break into. And I'll give you an example, you know, policy spaces, programs teams continue to remain predominantly white. And once people of colour do manage to enter into those spaces, you know, there's a really strong necessity to speak the language, to code switch. I think, again, in those spaces in particular, we can't abstract race from class dynamics. Again, going back to what Sanam was saying, you know, Britain is a deeply classist society and international development is incredibly elite. And people in the research have given multiple examples of how nepotism is still very prevalent in hiring decisions or in deciding on internship placements. I think, you know, in relation to hiring, because that's what we're discussing at the moment, what some of the qualitative research really shows is that there's still this kind of white gaze that's very deeply embedded within so much of our hiring practices. And by this, I mean, you know, the way the jobs advertised, you know, the way they're constructed, the way they're advertised, the kind of the essential versus desirable criteria, they continue to measure non-white people against a very white standard. And I think this is about, you know, the types of knowledge or expertise we value in the sector reproduces these racial hierarchies. So I think someone touched on this earlier, but what the research shows is there's still this, you know, a lack of valuing of lived experience by hiring managers. Certainly across the UK NGO sector. So someone may be from a particular country or region, they may speak local languages, they may have family and friends there, they may be of the religion practiced in that country, yet they'll still lose the opportunity for promotion, or they'll still lose the job to a white peer who has work experience with, I don't know, the right type of organization, be it the World Bank or the UN. so I think that white gaze is very deeply embedded, and we would do really well to kind of take a step back and reflect on that. And I think, you know, I also want to talk about what happens to people when they do get into leadership positions, because, you know, one thing you'll hear organizations say a lot is, well, you know, we've got a woman of color on our board, or, you know, our CEO is a woman of color. But I also want to speak about the difficulties they face as being kind of a minoritized group in a primarily very white structure. So some of the issues in particular that women of color face are around, you know, high levels of micromanagement, even though they're in a senior level position, so they're unable to kind of exercise their autonomy, lack of respect from junior colleagues. The threshold for their achievement is much higher than it is for their white peers. You know, things like you might need a white gatekeeper, or you might need a white mouthpiece if you want to kind of push forward your agenda or influence effectively. And I think these kind of racist tropes for women still really prevail. You know, I think women in particular, they need to not just conform to norms of whiteness, they also need to conform to gender norms. So, you know, we hear multiple examples of women who say, you know, I brought this issue around anti-racism to the board or to my senior management team, and I was told that the way I framed my demands was quote unquote too angry, or it was too divisive, or it was too alienating. So it can be, yeah, a very lonely space. I think once you know, even when you do make it, the challenges aren't, you know, by no means over.
Yeah, Melissa or Sanam, does this echo the experiences of your members in your group?
Yeah, I was just going to add some of the stories that we're hearing that perhaps would echo some of the things that Layla was sharing there. The fact that it's systematic, so then you can't just kind of put somebody within an existing rotten system and expect them to have different results. So some of the tales that we heard on the side of the hiring managers, when we met with them recently, we had around 25 of them around a table just kind of talking about what their experiences are as some people of color, some not people of color, as recruitment and hiring managers, accepting that the actual system itself within development in winning work from our clients, the commercial aspect, very much drives maintaining the status quo. So be it the challenge of some of our clients that have certain expectations of the type of individual to put in that leadership position, not actually wanting to have nationals to hold that position of authority, and being quite overt in that in some cases. And also the time limits in finding the right candidate, not having existing pools that are diverse, so we're drawing on the same well, which is empty when it comes to people of color. So things like that then mean that we just kind of maintain that nepotism that Layla spoke of. Is it comes up in, I think, every booster call that we do, someone kind of is banging their head against, you know, even in recruitment policies, this encouraging, you know, you have a friend from the university, you know, invite them and we'll reward you with X amount of money. Well, great, we're going to get Tom again, we're going to get Ben again, and that's going to be the story. We're not going to get the diversity. So there was also this distinction between the HR, so kind of the home office, head office recruitment, and the control which HR teams have there, and the lack of control when it comes to the actual projects. And that's very much held by the project managers, who then inform the HR teams of what they're looking for. So, for example, Sanam really advocates for, once the home office starts to look a bit more diverse, once the program managers and the finance managers and HR teams look a bit more diverse in London or in Birmingham, wherever your office is, then perhaps we'll start to have some pushback on the lack of diversity on the project side and the leadership by locals and nationals of organizations. And finally, some of the challenges faced again on the commercial side, if I want to push back, and it was really encouraging to see that some of the HR managers actually wanted change, but commercially it doesn't make sense. I'm not going to win this bid if I push back against the client and say, no, we should have, I don't know, Kwame as the team leader instead. But you want to have this senior expert with 50 years of experience in customs reform. And there's only ever been one university that allowed to get that qualification. It was how many years ago? So you know who you're going to get with the job description that you're, or the TOR that you're advising on. But their point was they want to do different, but commercially it doesn't make sense. So how can they advocate for that? So one exciting thing we have coming up is kind of a conversation with one of our clients, a key client in our sector, and hiring managers, again, to have that conversation and for them to be able to advocate and to say, you know, look, we identify an issue and we want to progress. We want to push this needle, as Lena says, we want to push this needle further. You're going to need to be the ones to help us. And a parallel we often draw in Bame Id is this movement for racial equity, diversity and inclusion is going to be best advanced. It's not how it ought to be, but best advanced with the kind of energy that came for the safeguarding agenda within our sector. It came from the client who said, actually, we mandate that this is part of how you deliver projects. So if we can kind of get that appetite within from our clients and donors, we think that will kind of be key in moving this faster, because at the moment we're working against them.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. A lot of the HR leaders I speak to, the challenge of they want to do better, but then at the end of the day, it's the hiring managers making the decision, and they're the male pale stale that Santa referenced earlier. They're likely to hire somebody like them. And the role of donors, right? So a lot of times these requirements are being passed down from a donor, as you say, that are probably needlessly onerous. So Santa, I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on the role of donors in driving change. And then Lena, it might be good to get your perspective too from Bond on that after.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, I think the best way to describe the push and pull factors, especially in regards to donors, is how Melissa was describing them earlier with the example of the safeguarding debate and the safeguarding agenda across the last few years, which was given new energy and spurred on by a specific event that occurred in 2018. Since then, many of our organisations have found that we've been focusing a lot more energy, time, resources, commitment to the safeguarding agenda to ensure the safety of our staff and beneficiaries as well. And that is not just been due to like reputational purposes, but because of ex-DFID, now the FCDO's push towards more stringent safeguarding policies and a focus on it and their enhanced due diligence as well. So one of the arguments that we've been seeing is that, well, if there was more example from the top, that being donors and clients, in their own hiring and what the dynamic of leadership looks like in their own organizations, then through to how they design programs and design the programs which we are then going to bid for, and then through to who they expect to see on those sorts of programs. So at all levels of the project cycle and at all levels of their own organisation, that will then have influence in the way that our organisations can operate. I have mixed feelings about this argument. I do think it's true that the donors have a big role to play and a big influence, but I also fear that some of our organisations, especially those with resource, might hide behind similarly to how Lena was saying, you know, hiding behind a DNI language to not talk about privilege and power. Sometimes I feel that some of the organisations in our space hide behind the need for client pushes and pulls, when actually we all have purchasing power ourselves when it comes to engaging in those conversations. That's why Melissa and I are quite excited about the ability to now start this dialogue with donors such as the FCDO and to say, let's have a frank conversation about how we can work together. As like Lena said earlier, this is for the benefit of everyone, that we're all doing ourselves a disservice and our our donors are doing themselves a disservice if they don't look at this seriously as well. When it comes to, if we see the way that the development sector is going, there are other sorts of clients that we're also dealing with. So not just governments, so the more corporate companies, there are different foundations, and they all have a role to play in their own corporate cultures or in their own company cultures to look inward first and then also engage in the conversation.
Yeah, Lena, are you hearing some conversations among the leaders that you work with, and there being more dialogue with donors and trying to push and change how some of these, it's sometimes something that seems so simple, a list of requirements on a job description, but has real ripple effects in how hiring happens in our sector.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, so donors do hold a lot of power, of course they do. And with the safeguarding agenda that we've had for the sector, that was certainly kicked in by the Charity Commission and then DFID. And I think particularly the CEOs of colour in the sector, which I agree with, don't perhaps want us to wait on external pressure coming from FCDO or donors. It shouldn't be that the sector can't get itself in order and want to move on this anti-racism agenda unless funders tell us to, or unless the FCDO tell us to. So that is an interesting dynamic, and which I personally do agree with, because I think there are enough people in the sector who want to meaningfully change and want to better the sector. It is changing, and slowly people are getting to this point as well. But it is quite an interesting concept to think about that, in that we want this to come from the donors. Why does it not come from us as the NGOs? In terms of the donors, they have to sort themselves out, really. They also have a problem with power dynamics and with representation in the sector. And one of the things that Charity So White was successful in was our open paper and funding call for funders to ring-fence 20% of their funding to go directly to BAME-led organisations for the COVID response. So off the back of that, Comic Relief is the one that I'll talk about quickly. They're the ones who then, rather than distributing funds themselves, got and interviewed in a very inclusive way and taken into account intersectionality, actually, the best BAME intermediary organisations to disperse the funds through. And that's also what they're doing with now their new fund that they've just opened up, the Global Majority Fund. It's them recognising they are not best placed. They do hold the money. They are not best placed to say where the money should go. They also recognise that the organisations who are best placed to support marginalised communities are BAME-led organisations who are from those communities and who understand the struggles and the challenges, particularly in COVID, and responding to that. And so with their Global Majority Fund, they are also going to go through BAME intermediaries as well. So it is about, and they are to some extent leading the way. They're the funder that comes to mind who are actually recognizing this and putting it into practice now and saying, when we have money, we're not just going to give it to the normal organizations that we have for years gone by. We are going to give it to people who know where the money should be. So yes, the donors can make changes. FCDO can make changes. FCDO have got a lot on their plate at the moment. Again, this pressure shouldn't have to come from outside of us. We should be able to drive this agenda forward ourselves.
Yeah, you bring up some really good points. And so speaking of maybe other excuses people can use to hide behind, you hear often that there's a pipeline challenge, right? And that we need to have a stronger pipeline of BAME people of color. Do you think that's true? Do you think it's a pipeline problem? Santa, I might see you shaking your head. Do you want to?
Bame Id is the pipeline. If you want a pipeline, we have so many amazing experts in the network. I think people have a misconception that some of these networks are specifically for those trying to enter a sector, who we definitely support. So students and career changers who want to lead an impact-led career. But Bame Id's membership consists of about a third from the private sector, about a third from the charity sector, maybe a quarter are independent consultants, and most of them are in their mid to senior part of their career. They're not entry level, and so when we do get told on bids, or you know, or even in our event with hiring managers, that there is a pipeline issue, I do shake my head, or I do have to laugh, because it's just because, as Melissa mentioned earlier, the way in which we recruit and the way in which bids are laid out with your 6-week turnover, it can be difficult to think outside the box in terms of how you research to find some of the experts. I think there needs to be a consistent effort to reach out to different sorts of experts, and not rely on your standard group of associates who you might always go to be a team leader. I think many, at least in the private sector, I'm sure many of us, many colleagues on the call would resonate with that challenge and that feeling. So it's important for companies and NGOs to have a committed effort to the long game of building their pipeline, and not just leave finding people to the last minute on bids, and then using that as an excuse to hire the person who was on the last bid, who happened to be on the last bid, and who happened to be on the last bid. So it is a long game.
Yeah, so putting in that effort and time now will reap benefits later. Go ahead, Melissa.
Yeah, just to add to that, like, I think when you kind of step back, as Sam kind of was closing on, and looking again from a strategic HR perspective about what do we want development to look like? What do senior leaders want their organizations to look like in the future? And to kind of be brave enough to acknowledge the current situation and to say, well, the whole of my corporate team are white. We want to look ahead to getting to a place in the next 2 years of having someone on our board that looks like myself or Stan, and when we're on this call, right? So how do we get there? And there are organizations that we've spoken to at a strategic level that are intentionally reimagining their organizations in the next 5 years, and having really innovative and really challenging ways of viewing what they want development to look like and seeing themselves as part of that picture. So actually decentering program management from being in the global north to the global south. We want our head office to be outside of the global north in 5 years' time. And I was like really, both Sam and I left that conversation with one of our stakeholders, I guess, really excited and quite like refreshed by the fact that people are thinking this laterally. But I do think that's kind of a very small number of senior leaders who are having that conversation or engaging diversity and inclusion experts to help them reimagine their organizations. But I think that's kind of what it takes, is that strategy and confidence to say, we're not where we ought to be. It's going to take an effort. It's going to take actively kind of looking at our current talent pool and preparing and helping lift some of the Black and brown individuals from my organization into more senior positions, not necessarily affirmative action, because I do believe in meritocracy, and I do believe the fact that you should be able to prove yourself right for that role. But at the same time, acknowledging that power differentials mean that there may need to be some training provided to help that person be ready for the 2 years' time when I want to progress them. And that's going to take effort and energy and intention. So that would be what I think the kind of key ingredients are for kind of building the pipeline and getting to a place where our leadership teams, our executive C-suites look a little bit different.
Yeah, and I'd like to expand on that a bit. And what you give some good examples of some changes or new ways that organizations can adapt. What are some of the changes that your group is advocating for, pushing for? What have you seen maybe working or not working that other organizations can learn from?
Sure. So diverse hiring panels, I think, is the main one across the board. So whether that is for internal hiring or whether that is for project hiring, because two of them, although are interlinked, they do come with their own challenges. And it is a case that HR departments have to look inwards and understand what their kind of capability and capacities for understanding diversity and inclusion, and ensuring, I know there's some organisations have banned all white panels, for example, like, you know, that's necessary in order to actually get to a point where we are seeing more diverse cohort of employees in the first place. So that's been something that a lot of people are really advocating for, and like looking at, as Melissa was saying, looking at meritocracies as well, not just the referral mechanisms, but actually trying to be more outbound in how you approach maybe the entry level, and not just going to the same places, but looking a bit more broader at different sorts of organizations, so different sorts of universities, or reimagining what an international development professional might look like, even at the earlier stages, I think is quite important, and I think is something our members were thinking about as well. And one of our members from a smaller consultancy has talked about looking at a project from an anti-racist lens, and through doing that and looking at all parts of the project cycle, you can identify different ways in which you can hire and bring more diverse outlook to a program as well.
Can I add intentional allyship to that too? So we do have people who kind of appear on our booster calls, and then surprise, they're not Black and brown, they're white, and they're very welcome to be there. And sometimes it's choosing to become a mentor. Sometimes it's selecting someone within your organization saying, I have power, you don't, I have privilege, you haven't been given this, and I'm going to use what I have to help mentor you, to grow you, to advocate for you, to give you opportunities you wouldn't necessarily have had were I not to kind of release some of my power and privilege and give some to you. So that's working. And I've even seen that in my own journey of being kind of not given a hand up, but given an opportunity. And I think that's what it takes. We're all capable in many ways to have even got into the sector. So now we're here kind of helping give a hand up or a platform to give that person a bit more prominence for their capabilities to be seen. It is great. So we need allies. We appreciate you. You know, it's difficult having power and privilege. It's easy to kind of stay with that and kind of just enjoy and sip your tea and call it a day. But actually relinquishing that and choosing to step into an uncomfortable space, I can't relate to how that feels, but I'm sure it's difficult. And kind of stepping into that space, it's brave, and we welcome you. So kind of just continue to push what's comfortable in order to kind of keep momentum going. We at Bame Id acknowledge that we need allies. Sanam and I spoke about at the very beginning whether we were going to keep it closed, keep it a safe space, because we do need that. But at the same time, we found the benefit of opening it up and just kind of getting into the mind of the ally, getting into the mind of the type of person who's willing to join a network that's primarily Black and brown. We're no longer the majority. How does that feel? And kind of learning a little bit about that. And that's been part of what we're seeing is working, having people that are willing to advocate at senior positions for this agenda.
And if I can add one more, sorry, if I could add one more thing to that, the way of getting more kind of Black and brown faces into the sector is, you know, ideally we wouldn't have any sort of old boys clubs, but I think, you know, what I like to say and what I say to Mel is in the interim, if we have to create our own through Bame Id, through charities, say, well, through any of these other organizations that are trying to build a better sector, then we're going to do that, because we still have to play the game of being in the current status quo alongside all of our peers. And although we can imagine and reimagine what aid looks like in the future, we still want to progress in this meantime. So opportunities, like, we welcome, you know, people joining the space and bringing opportunities to our networks and saying, look at this job, if you want to apply, message me and we'll talk about the company or talk about your skill set. Other you know, other groups have had that forever, and it hasn't really been the case for us. And that was definitely some anecdotal evidence that came out in our Bame Id calls, but also through recent event that happened with the British Expertise on Black History Month, where they were trying to elevate the elevate the voices of Black leaders within our sector, pretty much everybody on that call who was sharing their story mentioned the importance of social clout within their own journey and within their career, and how important it was to know somebody. And that shouldn't be the case, but it frankly is at the moment. So that's why we're really we find it really important to kind of build these spaces for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, as well as that it shouldn't also only be the responsibility of Black and Brown people to solve, right? So I guess finding that balance. Layla, I would love to hear your thoughts on, what advice would you give to those in positions of power, and how they can lead meaningful change within their organizations and across the sector?
Yeah, of course. So I think, just to say, everything I want to share here is based on all the discussions Lena and I have with people of colour working in the sector, and their experiences. And I often think, gosh, if I were leading this person's organisation, how would I practice my leadership? I mean, the first thing I want to talk about is accountability, because I think we've got a real chance now, leaders have a real chance now to demonstrate what I would call proactive accountability around anti-racism work. And I think the problem at the moment is we only tend to talk about accountability when something goes wrong. And often then there's quite a few high profile examples of leaders not getting it right. So, as we all know, we've just seen a very prominent example of a white leader of a women's rights organization step down from her role after accusations of racism. But her resignation statement made no mention of this, and she presented her resignation as an altruistic act. And from all the conversations I have from women who were tangentially involved in that incident, that wasn't accountability. So I think leaders are being offered now a golden opportunity to learn from that and do better. And to me, proactive accountability is really understanding how you might be complicit in upholding and reproducing some of these racial hierarchies on which our sector is based. And I think, just to bring it to life, how might a leader be complicit? Well, for example, when we fail to value people's lived experiences, when we ask people of colour to frame their demands for anti-racist practice in ways that we find palatable. And, in all of the organising work Lena and I do, we know that this kind of stuff happens on a very regular basis. The other thing I want to talk about is whiteness. We haven't really discussed whiteness and people's lack of stamina or lack of ability to actually engage with the concept of whiteness, certainly in many parts of the UK NGO sector. This idea of whiteness as a system, as an ideology, is really challenging for many leaders. People of colour tell us, when they try and mention some of these concepts around white supremacy, they get high levels of defensiveness from their white colleagues, and quite a lot of backlash when they do. So one thing I want to say to leaders is, if you are becoming more comfortable talking about race during these times, post Black Lives Matter, if you can start to talk about race, great. But if you can talk about race or diversity and equity, but you can't talk about whiteness, then I'm really not sure how far we're gonna go. It may sound harsh, but there is a hierarchy at play here. And I think your ability as a leader to be able to name that very powerful system is instrumental to bringing about change. And then the last thing I want to say, it kind of builds on some of what Melissa and Sanam have been saying, but I might take it a bit of a radical step further. I want to talk about power, and let's take the UK. I think it's only about 3% of charity board members in the UK are people of colour. So I want to say to leaders in the sector, white leaders, you're going to have to share power. Or dare I say it, you're going to have to give power up at some point, and you're going to have to hand over the baton. And I do worry that all of these low-cost, high-noise actions that we're seeing across certain parts of the NGO sector, and by that I mean, solidarity statements, the black squares, some of the diversity policies, that it's a substitute for really genuine change, and it's becoming a bit of a substitute for people being willing to step down or distribute power in a much more equitable way. I think, like Melissa said, that there will be exceptions, but they're few and far between. And I want to say, I know this might be difficult, I want to say to every white leader working in this space, I think you should be able to answer the question, how am I working towards no longer being present in this space? Right? And that's going to feel very uncomfortable. But I think as a leader who is really committed to working on anti-racism work, it's incumbent on us, on you, to really engage with that question.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that powerful statement there. And we are just about at the end of our time, but before we go, I'd like to ask each of you, if we were to reconvene a year from now, what do you hope will have changed that we could celebrate or talk about? Lena, I'll start with you.
I mean, what I hope would have changed, that anti-racism as it is outside of equity, diversity and inclusion is honoured and acknowledged as its own separate piece of work, that more white people who hold power have actively moved to addressing how they can either lead in a very meaningful way or have gotten out of the way, and have supported and backed people of colour in the sector to be in positions of power. It's a year's time though, so this work is not going to change overnight, and I wouldn't expect it to after 400 years of history to get to this point anyway. So if we're able to at least start to openly have the conversations, start to see shifts within organizations, even individual ones, that would bring me hope. But also for and it's white leaders to be more open to discussing things like this within their own organizations and hearing the voices of the people of color on their staff. And I would also probably measure it by trauma and see in a year's time how exhausted are Black and brown people. Are we still really exhausted, or do we feel like we have support and have organizations invested in this work?
Yeah, thank you. Melissa. Oh.
Sure, I think internal accountability and external accountability would be something that I'd like to see as just the norm. So be that scorecards internally, be that cross-sector accountability that's beyond the statements that Layla spoke about, that there's really tangible things that companies can point to. Like last year we released a statement, this year we've done XYZ, and that's meaningful, that's led to change. Now we've appointed this board member, we now have a equity or inclusion lead. Something tangible would be really great, and I'd love to see those black squares be filled with actual actions that have taken place over the year. That's what I'd like to see, accountability.
Layla, how about you?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Lena says. I think I'd love to see broader based alliances working on this issue, because I think that will really take the pressure off people of colour who are just really exhausted at the end of the year. So, and I think we've made a good start. We've got Bame Id, who are a shining example for us around some of that coalition building work, and I'd like to see the momentum step up on that.
Anna, we'll let you have the final word here. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I almost went the whole call without that issue. I think along the lines of what Melissa was saying, what I would like to see is the main kind of strategic suppliers, especially in the private sector, actually showing commitment and in the same way that they have done for the safeguarding agenda. So if we could have some, if within a year's time, some kind of strategic outlook when it comes to how we're going to progress on EDI and addressing power and privilege. And then along the lines of what Lena and Layla were saying, another thing I'd like to see is that acknowledgement of the energy, effort the physical, mental energy it takes for Black and brown people to do this work. I think one thing when it comes to Bame ID's booster calls, I end every session with a breath, and I tell everyone to remember it's not their individual responsibility to change the way the aid sector operates. So I want everyone to be acknowledged and the energy to be acknowledged.
Thank you. Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your time and experience, insights today. I'm sure our audience took away a lot, so we'll use your parting words as our marching orders for a path forward. So thank you again for joining us today, and for everyone who tuned in. I hope we can check back in the future to see what progress has been made. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you want to read more on combating racism in global development, please follow our coverage on Devex, something we will be continuing to cover as part of our editorial priorities. And if you're an organization looking to increase diversity in your hiring, you can also contact the Devex Talent Solutions team, who can work with you on outreach, sourcing, search, the focus on underrepresented groups. But in the meantime, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you for your time.